I think we can go ahead and get started soon. I'll wait for Mike to start the recording. So again, hello everyone. My name is Danushka Samarakon. I'm a SLIM graduate. Right now, I work as the head of library technology at the University of Miami. And for the past few semesters, I've been teaching at SLIM too. So today, my presentation is on emerging technologies in libraries and its ethical implications. So this is how I have structured the presentation. First, we will look at some of the recent developments in the field of emerging technologies and their applications in the industry. Then, how these technologies can be used within libraries. What tools and technologies are available if you want to learn more about them. To begin, I have listed some recent developments in the field. Data mining, big data and decision making, artificial intelligence, machine learning. So you probably have heard about some of these terms. These concepts have been used in the industry for some time now. And they are making their way, in some cases they already are being used in libraries and archives. For example, when we say data mining, what comes to mind? Let's take companies like Amazon or Google, for example. These organizations, they collect data. And data mining is the process of going through that data and processing that to learn more about you and your habits. So in case of a private corporation like Amazon, the goal is to identify your buying patterns and suggest you more items. When it comes to industries, these are used with business or profit on mind. But how can we make use of these technologies in order to better serve our patrons? So before we begin, let's take a look at these different terms. When we say artificial intelligence, it means any technique which enables computers to mimic human intelligence. So essentially, the word we are looking for here is intelligence. Rather than the human intelligence, we are trying to create artificial intelligence. In the 1980s, another subset of AI emerged, which is called machine learning. This is a branch of AI, and it gives computers the ability to learn and make decisions without being exclusively programmed to do so. Now, what does that mean? Typically, when you write a program, you have a set of instructions, and that computer follows the set of instructions to accomplish a task. Let's take the ILS, or the Integrated Library System, for example. You have coded the functionality in it. When a patron walks up to the circus with a book, you scan their ID, so the system knows who the patron is. Then you scan the book, and the system knows what the book is. So when you issue the command, it assigns the item and loads it out to the patron. So in this instance, the system has explicit instructions on what to do. But in case of machine learning, you give the machine a set of data and you ask the machine to look at the data and learn. So another subset of machine learning emerged around 2010. It's called deep learning. Here, the mathematicians and computer scientists, they looked at machine learning techniques and they developed a technique where you can mimic human brain or the neuron system. So it goes through the machine learning process, but it makes the computation of multi-layer neural networks feasible. We'll talk more about this in the upcoming slides. Now, what is AI? AI is programming computers to complete tasks that would require human intelligence. So what does this mean? If you are counting the number of books on a stack, that doesn't necessarily require intelligence. You are simply counting. So if the machine were to do it, it would simply be a program which doesn't require intelligence. But if you are cataloging a set of books, or if you are writing descriptive metadata for digitized photographs, those are not straightforward tasks. They require some sort of intelligence. So when a machine works on these tasks, it needs AI or artificial intelligence. Machine learning is kind of AI where the computer learns to optimize itself by using examples or past experiences. So what does that mean? We will look at some examples. So based on the previous one, if you give a machine a set of books with cataloging information, then machine looks at those past examples. Then it learns what to do. So essentially the machine does what the data tells it to do, not the program. So this is a screenshot from Google Trends, where the field of study machine learning and how it grew over the years. As you can see, the growth still continues. Now here you can identify right around 2014, 2015, that's when it started picking up as a field of study. And you can clearly see it's been gaining interest and expanding its applications in the industry. With that being said, now let's take a small quiz. Here I have 3 sonnets. Out of these 3, 2 have been written by a human and 1 has been written by a machine. Mike could start a poll now and you would be able to vote using that. So what I am asking you to do is vote for the sonnet that you think that was created by a machine. I'll give few minutes for you to kind of complete the poll. Thank you for the answers. Now let's take a look at the results. So as you can see, we have about 33% voted for the option A, and then about 50% voted for the option B, and only 17% voted for option C. So by looking at these results, as you can see, there's no clear winner. There is votes are distributed evenly. So let me go to the next slide. So what you see on the right-hand side, option C, that's the poem that was written by a machine. So here you see an article posted on the competition. I took this poem from the sonnet from that article. And as you can see, based on that article, what they talked about is how it was submitted to a competition. And even though this particular sonnet didn't win the competition, it was good enough to pass as a human created sonnet. So as you can see, machine learning is improving. And in this particular case, we are talking about something called Turing test. which was conducted in 2016. So what is a Turing test? Turing test is the machine can pass the test if it can prove itself to be indistinguishable from a human. So in 2016, a team submitted this particular sonnet to a competition, and the goal was to convince the judges into thinking the sonnet was written by a human. So each judge was asked to read 10 sonnets and decide whether they were written by a human or a machine. They could not fool all the judges in this case, but as you can see, it's getting harder and harder to distinguish between the two. So with that being said, let's do one more quiz. Here I have two paintings. One was drawn by a machine and the other one was drawn by a human. Again, you will see a poll on your screen. I'm asking you to vote on the artwork that's created by a machine. Thank you for your votes. So you can see the results now. So in this instance, I would say, yeah, you guys did well. The first painting, that's the one that was created by a machine. But what I wanted to showcase is, yeah, artwork similar to what we have here in A. Sometime back, yeah, we could never think that a machine could create something like this. But now the technology has improved. It's catching up to what humans could do. So with that being said, let's look at some industry applications of machine learning, how these new technologies are being used in the industry. Here we see a screenshot from a self-driving car that shows how the machine or the car sees the world. As you can see, the car sees the world through cameras and various other sensors. It takes a picture of its surroundings, then it identifies the cars, the pedestrians, it has outlines on the building structures and the road and even the road signs. So what does it do with this information? It processes all of these individual informations and based on that makes an informed decision on what to do next. These decisions are not programmed. The machine is actually using that information and processing, and it's making the decision on what to do. So this is just one example where machine learning and AI are being used in the industry. And here, that's a second example, the Merck competition results. Here, the machine is trying to analyze slides of lung cancer tissue samples. And then it's trying to look at the growth in cancer tissue samples and tries to improve the accuracy of tumor classifications. So in this example, what they're saying is computers, they can do a better job of predicting lung cancer types than humans. Here's the third example. The goal of this test was to review legal documents. And as you know, legal documents are lengthy and complicated. It's a very tedious job to review these documents. So they did a test where they asked some lawyers to review documents, and then they asked the AI to review documents. So at the end of the results, AI was able to achieve an accuracy level of 94%, while lawyers achieved a level of 85%. Now, this is a very good example of AI use. Reviewing these large documents is such a monotonous and a tedious task for a human. But it's a perfect task for a machine. Machine could go through the documents, identify errors, and then they could tag what it thinks the errors in the documents are. Then later, a human could go and review only those points that have been tagged by the machine, rather than go through the whole document. So with all of these being said, let's look at what opportunities are there in GLAMs or galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. How can we use these emerging technologies to our benefit? First, I want to talk about handwritten recognition using deep learning. As you know, in archives, there are a lot of historical documents. And nowadays, the trend is to digitize most of these, especially from a preservation standpoint and also from a dissemination standpoint. So when you digitize these documents, one of the problem is you have the associated technical metadata that gets generated during this digitization process. That is machine readable. But the problem is that's not enough to search for documents. So what about the full text? If you have the full text, that would provide valuable information that someone could use in the search process. OCR has been used for some time, for a long time, especially when it comes to printed documents. In case of printed documents, it works very well. But the problem is in this optical character recognition, what the machine does it looks at the scanned or the digitized document, it extracts the characters and put them in textual format that is readable by a machine. So in case of printed documents, this works well. But when it comes to handwritten documents, the level of accuracy of OCR goes down significantly. Because there's no uniform standard. Everyone's handwriting is different. And sometimes some individuals have better handwriting compared to others. And based on the medium that they use to write, or if they are using a pen or a pencil, that all depends, that all plays a role in that how that handwriting shows up. So in these cases, it's hard for the OCR to produce accurate results. We can use technologies such as OpenCV and TensorFlow to create more robust workflows to develop better handwritten recognition softwares or programs. As I discussed earlier, I won't go deep into these individual technologies, but rather point you towards few resources. So if you are interested in that, you can start your research. So computer vision and machine learning based OCR improvement. So this goes along the same line. This is one of the grant-funded projects that I worked some time back. The goal here is to improve the accuracy of OCR inputs. But what happens when the source document or the scanned image, if that's not in good quality, then those issues would show up in the final product, in the outcome, the textual document that gets produced from the OCR process. In this instance, what we are trying to do is we are trying to use NLP or natural language processing to process documents and increase the level of accuracy. So how are we going to achieve this? Here we are using NLP and we are feeding the source documents into the engine and ask the machine to process it. So it's looking for language patterns. For example, let's say OCR recognizes one word as one IKE. So it doesn't make much sense. So what the NLP engine does is it looks at that information and it makes an informed decision that the first letter cannot be a 1 because words don't start like that. And then it sees the next 3 letters. Okay, it's IKE. So a machine could recognize, okay, the 1 is visually similar to a lowercase l. So this is probably machine made a mistake. The OCR engine made a mistake in interpreting the letter. It cannot be 1, it should be lowercase l. And then the NLP engine suggests instead of 1 IKE, this is probably LIKE, like. So that's the process that NLP engine uses to improve the information. So why are we doing this? What's the purpose? The main purpose is to make it easier to conduct a search. The ability to search an article and find exactly what you are looking for. And then you can also use it to develop trends. See how science, politics, health, or other opinions have shifted over the years or decades. And third is creating learning tools. This technology allows better visualization. So if you have better data, it will help you create more accurate visualizations. And it will generate more interest and enthusiasm that will better engage the audience. So what are some of the technologies that you can use to improve the accuracy of text corpus? And what can you do with this improved accuracy? So before we move on to that point, I want to talk about what the text corpus is. Here, when we say text corpus, that's the resulting document, the machine readable document that gets outputted from the OCR process. Here are three use cases for that document. One is topic modeling. Topic modeling is identifying topics for research by analyzing the documents. Then we can do sentiment analysis. That's essentially analyzing the documents for overall tone and the sentiment of the documents. And finally, document classifications. If you want to classify the document into multiple categories, having a good text corpus makes that job easier. Now let's move on to another topic, voice-based assistants. Some of you might have these devices at home, Amazon Echoes or Google Homes, or even Siri on iPhones. How can we use them in libraries? There are multiple ways that you could use them. Here in this example, they have developed an Alexa app so that individuals with Echo devices can load them into their devices and use that to access library services. So how does it help the patrons? One way it could help is if there's a visually impaired individual who has an Echo device at home, they could use that to search the library catalog. Or if they find a book that they want, they can place a hold on it. For example, let's say another scenario. You have a large digital screen near the entrance to the library that displays today's event. So you can place a voice-based assistant next to that. So if there's a visually impaired individual, they can interact with that device, with the voice assistant device, and get the same set of information that's displayed on the screen. Now, if you are interested in any of these technologies, I'll direct you towards the starting point of the frameworks and tools that are available. Again, I won't get very detailed into this. So Jovo is a popular platform to develop voice experiences that works across all these multiple devices. So if you're interested in the field, it's a good framework because it standardizes the workflow. You don't have to develop code individually for each device. You only have to create one set of instructions and the framework takes care of the rest. Now let's talk about decision making and predictive analysis. If you have a large set of data, you can use that for predictive analysis. So how can this be used in the libraries? If you have circulation information, then you can mine that data to make decisions about your collection development practices. What you can do, what books or what articles would be popular in the upcoming year, what's trending right now, what sort of genres were people interested in, and what they would be interested in the future. You can make all of these decisions based on the patterns that you get from the data mining practices. Now let's talk about search algorithms. Nowadays, most libraries have moved away from traditional OPACs into discovery platforms. So this is just one screenshot how these search algorithms works. When you submit a query, it doesn't blindly look for the keywords similar to how the old OPACs used to do. Instead, it uses multiple techniques. It looks at the language, the stemming, citations, stop words, and even correct spelling mistakes, and then it gets a query match. Now, once it has the query match, then it uses the item value score. It looks at the search query and it tries to identify the best result that it should push upward, similar to how the Google search result works. And finally, it looks at the user profile. That's the final component that they use to complete the search. If you have your discipline of study or your past search criteria stored in your user profile, it will use that to enhance your search query. Here I have listed two technologies. Both of them are open source. One is Apache Solr, other one is Elasticsearch. This could be used if you are interested in learning more about search indexing. For example, for graduating upcoming SLIM graduates, if they are looking for a position in a library related to technology or digital asset management, gaining skills such as this technology would help them in their job hunt. Now let's talk about faceting. So all of us know what faceting is. For example, if you do a search on Amazon for a mobile phone, on the left-hand side, you get all the facets. So one facet could be manufacturer, saying it's Apple, Samsung, Motorola. Another one would be carrier, AT&T, T-Mobile. So all of these facets make it easy for us to narrow down the search results. Now, what about libraries? In this example, I'll talk about the newspaper archive. So you can have the metadata that comes with the historical newspapers, the name of the newspaper, the year it was published in, the date, month. You could have these as facets. But what if you use natural language processing to process the full text of these newspaper articles and extract entities? This is called name entity recognition. So how does it work? The engine goes through the full text article, and whenever it sees a name, it tags it as a person. When it sees a location, it tags it as a location. And if it sees a organization such as ALA, ACRLA, or even AAA, it tags it as an organization. So you can pull all these individual categories and place them as facets to make the search process easier for the end user. So this is another example of descriptive metadata generation. This is another project that I received a grant for. During my employment at the University of Utah, we created a machine learning based toolkit to generate descriptive metadata for historical images. So I won't get too deep into this project because I'll be talking about it in detail in the upcoming webinar. But for the time being, I just want to show you what that means. So here the machine looks at the photograph and it tries to tag individual objects in the photograph, the crowd, woman, camera. That cat is not correct, but that's where the machine went wrong. But once it generates these labels, then it uses a technique to construct complete sentences. That's in the step 2. And once it has the sentences, it has the confidence rating associated with each of these sentences. Essentially, what that means is how confident the machine is that that particular sentence is correct. So based on those rankings, it re-ranks the sentences. And here the first one say, a woman holding a camera in the crowd. So TensorFlow. TensorFlow is a machine learning platform that can be used across range of tasks, such as what we talked about earlier. But it has a particular focus in training and inference of deep neural networks. So this is a chart from an article published in February of last year. As you can see, majority of the libraries have not entered into the AI domain. And there could be future growth opportunities, especially for new graduates that are planning on entering into academic libraries. So what are some of the issues that we should think about when we try to implement these technologies? We talked about machine learning, which by itself is a black box. So there could be trust issues. and there could be privacy issues related to these technologies. So let's go through few of them and see what we can make of it. First, we have to make a clear distinction between the data we can collect versus what we should collect. Just because we have access to data doesn't necessarily mean that we have to collect everything. If we want, we can collect the browsing habits and browsing patterns, logs from public computer terminals in the library. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should collect it. So it's up to you to decide what data you should collect in your library. When you think about private corporations such as Google, why do they collect data? They collect everything, your browsing habits, travel reservations, your photos, everything. And they use that knowledge to figure out how to sell you things. But when it comes to libraries, we have to be mindful about patron privacy. So that's why we shouldn't collect everything. So how do we identify the sweet spot, or how do we find the balance between collecting some data that we can use to improve services for patrons, at the same time respect the privacy of the patrons? So when you talk about privacy, should we blindly trust external entities? In most cases, we use external vendors or service providers in order to carry library operations, whether it's your integrated library system, discovery service, or proxy services. Most of these are hosted in the cloud by vendors, and that's the direction the industry is heading. So what does this mean for us? What data do we send them? What are they expected to do with those data? We should ask these questions. Are they using the demographic information to improve search queries? If not, what are they using it for? So each individual piece of data that they request, you should be thinking about it. You should be thinking it through and what they could be using it for. Does that enhance the operation of the application? Then what about data retention? Once you send the data, does that mean they can retain the data forever? Or would they be purging from time to time? What if you move away from the vendor? Are they obligated to purge all the data? So it's important to review service agreements and contracts to know where you stand when it comes to these operations. So let's talk about this article. This is about a few years old, 2-3 years old, and it's about technology and privacy. In the earlier days of Amazon Echo, they mentioned that search queries are only processed by machines, and no human would see the data. But to the contrary, some news articles highlighted that Amazon staff has been reviewing search queries. So whenever an incident such as this comes up, what they do is they point to the ULA, or the end user licensing agreement, and say it was disclosed in the document. But do we really read the end user licensing agreements? And do they create them knowing that users don't really pay attention to it? So here we have to think about what they actually do versus the general perception they try to create. There are settings that you can use to tweak privacy and other operation, but in most cases, these settings are hidden underneath multiple options. With that being said, so what are some of the hidden dangers? In some of these things that I talked about, the issues were pretty obvious, but not all issues. Some of the issues are hidden. They will create privacy and security issues without you even thinking about it. Facebook like button. It was introduced long time back. The article itself is almost 10 years old. If you add the like button to your website or a blog, it provides you with good statistics. You can see how many people liked it, what's the outreach like, and you can base your marketing efforts depending on that information. But at the same time, when you place these external snippets of code, you are giving these external entities access to the behaviors, online behaviors of your patrons. I mean, if they are on the Facebook website, then of course it's understandable that they are being tracked. But now they go a step beyond that. Even on the library website, they can track the users. So when the page loads, the button is loading and it collects information and sends it back to the Facebook services. And this could happen even without the user clicking on the button. So Patron really doesn't have a say in it. Here's another one. It's not just Facebook, or most of the other companies do it. So more and more applications are using this technique for tracking users across the sites. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is when you find some third-party tool that improves functionality, research on it. Just read up on it and see what complications that it would create in terms of privacy and security. So aside from online tracking, it doesn't stop there. Let's talk about physical location tracking. If you think about hotels, shopping malls, conference facilities, or even airports, there are devices that it could track your physical location. For example, wireless access points and Bluetooth beacons that could be placed all over the facility to identify how the traffic flows. And some of these devices, they could be marketed to the libraries, especially larger libraries with a significant square footage. These devices could be placed across the building, and that would give you an idea on how the patron flow works in the building, how patrons moves, what areas are crowded and what's not. I mean, this is good. This information can be used to make the library space better. It could be used for the decision-making process on how to set up your furniture, the computer arrangements, where to put the stacks versus where to put a book display. But at the same time, do we want to track the patrons? I'm not saying yes or no. I'm asking you to think about that and make an informed decision. Now, what if you put a disclaimer notice at the entrance saying that your physical location would be tracked? Does it make it right? So these are some of the internal discussions that you should have before implementing any of these technologies. Here's another very useful tool, Google Analytics. It's good for usability studies. So if you have a website, Google Analytics provides valuable information on the usage of that site. You can see which pages are getting accessed the most, where the users are coming from, what time of the day, or which month did you get most users, and you can use all of this information to improve the website. But at the same time, while doing that, you are providing information about your patrons to Google, and they will use these to improve their advertising strategies. So invariably, you are helping a private corporation increase their profits by using your patron data. So now let's talk about data biases, especially when it comes to homogeneous data. Anyone else feels like Netflix algorithm and of suggestion movies doesn't really work? Not always. Like for example, if you watch a foreign film, then it would start suggesting movies from that same language. But it won't do the same for English movies. Why is that? It's not intentional, but what's happening here is the data set is too small for foreign movies, foreign films. So the system creates a bias towards it. But there are lots of Hollywood movies. So the system can draw patterns and subdivide them into smaller buckets. It would say, okay, action movies, comedies versus documentaries in English. But if you're talking about a French movie, then it doesn't have enough data to subdivide it further. So it puts all of them into one broad category. So the result is, if you watch one French movie, it would start suggesting you other French movies. It doesn't matter whether you watched a documentary and now it's suggesting action movies, but it won't do the same thing for English movies because it has a large data set. So in the earlier example, we talked about the diversity of data affecting your movie choices. But now let's take a look at another example which creates more impact on the society. what happens when you use data mining on bad or incomplete data? For example, when credit institutes were using discriminatory practices to determine creditworthiness, those biases impacted the data, and the past data is already bad. So when the technology advances and we are using data mining on the same set of data, those biases are then going to show up in the results. So traditionally, if credit was denied to a certain demographic, the machine is going to look at it and think that that particular demographic has an inherent risk associated with it. So the new machine learning AI-based engines, they are going to determine the creditworthiness of an individual, and they are going to have the same biases. Now, if we bring this into libraries, let's say you use AI engines for collection development practices, like we discussed earlier. So in the past, maybe 100 years ago, libraries have been mainly accessible for only individuals with a higher socioeconomic status. It's not necessary for individuals at a disadvantage. So the collection development strategies, the books, genres that people have been interested in, it represents this reality. Now, if you are using that data for analysis and depends on it for collection development decisions in the future, it will show the same inherent biases in the future decision-making process. So these are some of the things to think about when you are working with new technologies. What about data incompleteness? This is one of the images from the digital collections at the University of Utah when I was working on some projects. So in this example, the photo is labeled as Father Leibler and some Navajo men. So even in this instance, it's naming one individual by name, but when it comes to Native Americans, they simply label them as Navajo men. They are not interested in learning their names. So when you feed this information to a machine, this incomplete data will play a role in how the machine is learning, and it will create a bias towards its decision-making process. Okay, here's another example. This tweet got national attention in 2015. So this is from Google Photos. Any one of you are using Google Photos, you would know that it categorizes your photos into different segments, different buckets. So you can easily scroll through them. So what happened here? I wouldn't say this was intentional, but that's what would happen when machine learning goes bad. So when people tag images as a form of mockery, machine cannot distinguish it from real data. Again, part of the problem is when your data set is not diverse enough. If the data set is very limited, those dirty data is going to have a much bigger impact on the decision-making process. So anyway, no matter what happens in the background, this will affect the community. And especially if you are using a technology such as this in the library, your reputation as an institute will be at stake. Here's another example of data biases. This article is from 2019. So police across US are training crime predicting AIs. So what they do is they give the machine the past data sets and they are training and asking it to recognize high-risk individuals. So here the data itself is dirty data. As you know, law enforcement patterns have been known to be discriminatory towards minority groups. And this bias is already reflected in the data. So when the machine sees this, the machine does not know about the discriminatory practices or the historical biases in the data. Machine will look at the data and it will teach the machine to discriminate. So for example, if the machine is tagging high-risk individuals and the data set shows that a certain demographic has been arrested more, then the same bias is going to show up in the decision-making process in the new AI. Again, here's another topic on past issues. Same issues, different platforms. So what am I talking here? We are talking about, all of us know about the questionable subject headings at the SE subject headings in the discussion surrounding that. So what happens if you blindly follow existing data without any thought? So we are going to transfer the issues to new platforms. Let's say you want to create a system to so that the machine could create metadata rather than manually do it. So you are training a machine to do that, and you are using the past data to train the machine. So if you have described a set of objects using a discriminatory subject heading, and you are giving the machine the same set of subject headings to learn, then the machine is going to learn from that. Machine sees the content and it sees that that content has been described using this particular questionable subject heading, and it will learn to describe similar content using the same term. And finally, let's talk about automation. So we can use automation to make our lives easier. It's a great way to get things done with minimal resources. But what are some of the dangers? So on the Martin Luther King Day in 2019, the Library of Congress tweeted about a Confederate general. And this drew criticism from the community. They later apologized and mentioned that these tweets, they were automated and this was not intentional. But at the same time, the damage has been done. The tweet is already out there. So what should we do? We should expect these scenarios when we are automating certain applications or processes. And we should have a plan in place to act accordingly. So now that we talked about the technologies and the issues associated with that, I want to take a moment to talk about few communities of individuals who are into technologies in libraries, not just libraries, GLAM institutes. So one is Code4Lib. Code4Lib has a website and a mailing list and a Slack channel. These mailing list and Slack channels, they are a good place to get answers from others if you are working on technologies in libraries. It's a good place to engage. So especially if you are planning on trying any of these technologies that I talked about, this is a good place to get answers to any questions that you have. Another community is AI for LAM, Artificial Intelligence for Libraries, Archives, and Museums. This group has monthly Zoom meetings. Feel free to join the group and join these meetings. In addition to that, they have working groups working in different problems that occur in GLAM institutes. You can join these working groups and get to know others, network in this domain. And at the same time, if you have questions, you can talk to others and get answers for those questions. So what's next? We talked about lots of technology and issues. So I want to summarize this by saying we don't have to be scared of new technologies. The tech landscape will continue to change and we have to evolve with it. But at the same time, we should recognize the issues and find ways to avoid them to make the technology work for us. Thank you, everyone. I have my contact information up here. You can always email me, but at the same time, I am willing to take questions from anyone if you have any topics that you would like to discuss.
I'm not sure if you were able to view the chat.
Oh, let me see. I am just loading the chat now. It was covered from my window previously.
But I was figuring that you were guiding me to the Code4Lib and the other one in regards to those two questions. But if not, if you can answer them, I would appreciate it or address it.
Sure. Okay. Okay, let me see. The first question is, was there any particular reason for the drop after 2016?
That was from the
yeah,
from
machine
the
learning field of study.
From the graph, the first graph that you
Yeah.
show, yes, sir.
I don't know about the particular reason, but it goes up and down. I think various other things like funding opportunities or other interests might play a part in it. But the overall trend keeps growing, even though it comes down, it picks back up again. So it is a growing field.
Yes, sir.
Then
And then
are you stating those two, Apache Solr and Elastic, are being used by libraries for research? If so, what geographical region? Mostly for mainly. If not, okay. Yeah, they can be used in various library systems. So, for example,
is it mostly academic?
yeah, I would say it's mostly academic.
Okay.
I might be wrong because my experience is with academic libraries, and I just don't know about other institutes that are using it. But when it comes to public libraries, normally it's larger libraries with a lot of staff and significant budget, like Boston Public Library, New York Public Library. They are involved in a lot of these projects, so they might be using it. But in my case, I have personally used some of these tools, both when I was working for Kansas State University as well as University of Utah. So the products are open source. You can use it in any context, but it's up to you to determine how it applies to your use cases.
And then my last question is, are you familiar with the For You Only from Dilobit software? It's supposed to be a password monitor or protector. Have you had any experience or heard anything of that
No,
particular?
I'm not familiar with that software. I just searched for it. I'll have to read up on that. I have not heard about that before.
Yes, sir. It was in one of the recent readings. But thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. And then I see another question from Dennis on the chat. Are there any articles or examples that you could point us to with examples of how this technology is being used? Uh, Dennis, are you referring to one particular technology?
I was thinking about how to use it for collection development, but also there was voice assistants, yeah. Voice assistant technologies too.
Sure. So in terms of voice assistant technology, in my slide, the slide I posted, let me see. Where it was. Yeah, that was from Broward County Library System in Florida. But I have seen similar application. I believe that was from UNC. So there are libraries that are experimenting in these with these technologies, and even at University of Utah, we were experimenting with that. But to the scale that they use it, it might differ from library to library. At some libraries, maybe they are using it in a production environment, so it's already available for patrons. But in some cases, individuals might just be still experimenting with the technologies.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. And have another question from Les. Do you have a list of articles you use? This was an question. Well, thank you for the comments. In terms of a list of articles, I don't have a particular list, but what I would suggest is go through Code4Lib is a good location, and let me post another link. here's another blog aggregator. These are good places to read up on things. Just scroll through the blog post and see if there's anything you like, and then you can use those search terms to dig deep into that. And Code4Lib has a open access journal. Even that would be a good place to read up on some of these technologies. So there's another question. Would you advise libraries to focus on Chromebooks for digital device lending, or do you have other digital device worth investing in the technology project plans? So in most cases, we don't particularly focus on one device. Rather, we focus on the delivery platforms. I mean, at least that's my philosophy. That way, you don't have to tie yourself to one particular platform. If the delivery service you are using supports multiple platforms, then users could use their own devices, or you could start lending different types of devices since your platform supports all of them. I know different libraries would have different philosophies on that. I mean, that's what I'm thinking.
Yes, I was just inquiring in regards to some upcoming projects and courses that I'm registered in. And then I also wanted to, because recently the library that I currently work in has transitioned to Chromebooks, but so many of the elder portion of the community was very attached to laptops. So, and I'm not, as far as following technology, I'm not as advanced as maybe the modern world. So, just trying to see other places that you would recommend or advise as far as digital devices. But is this a link to something in regards to digital device lending or something else?
No. Earlier, I posted that link, but I didn't realize that it only went to the Slim Tech Circle. So I reposted that link. This was with regard
Oh,
to
within the thing.
Articles.
Yes,
Where to find articles. I had to repost
Well,
that link since it didn't go out
yes,
to
sir.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions, thank you everyone for joining this webinar. Have a good rest of the day.